What if Chvrches were 80s Celtic rock revivalists? That's what we hope to find out on this week's What If, How and Why. Hiya, my name's Morgan Brown, and every Monday I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel. The idea of these videos is that each week I take a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe scenario in which a changing set of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I have kicking around here in order to bring that alternative version to life. So the song that I chose this week was Leave a Trace by Chvrches, and I tried to reimagine that in the style of 80s Celtic rock. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster.
I have somehow left away with everything. Anything you ever did was strictly by design. That's about it wrong. Go anywhere but there. And you have this belief that you're gonna build what I don't need. And I know I need to feel release. And I know you'll never fall, but I believe nothing that I'm told. And I know I need to feel release. I know I need to feel release. Take care to tell it just as it was. Take care to tell on me for a while. I need to feel release. Take care to bury all that you can. Take care to leave a trace of my.
So Chvrches are a band that I've been hearing the name of for years, but until just recently I was under the impression that I'd never heard a note of their music. It's funny really, the only reason I investigated them really was that I was given a suggestion of doing something on this channel in the style of Big Country. Didn't want to focus too much just on that one specific band. I prefer to do things in the style of a whole genre rather than just one band. So I thought, well, I'll broaden that out to sort of 80s Celtic rock. And it'd be really cool to do that with a more contemporary Scottish band, but then couldn't think of any contemporary Scottish bands. Being the out-of-touch old man that I am, everyone I was thinking of was 30 years out of date. So just basically Googled contemporary Scottish acts and came up with Chvrches, and I was like, oh, Chvrches, they're famous. I don't think I know what they sound like. And then when I listened to a couple of songs, I realised I had actually heard at least a few songs, particularly the one that they did in collaboration with Marshmello, which was all over the radio for a while. I wasn't too keen on that just because Marshmello turns everything into something that just sounds like him, and I'm not particularly keen on what he does. But a bunch of the other songs I actually found to be pretty cool, so I decided they were definitely going to be a good choice. I say a contemporary act, they've actually been around for ages now, but I was just really slow on the uptake. If, like me until recently, you don't know very much about them, they were formed by Ian Cook, or it might be Ian. It's one of those Scottish spellings with two I's, which can always catch you out. I'm just going to call him Ian. I'm sorry if I've got it wrong. He was in a band in the late 90s and into the 2000s called Aerogram. Pretty great indie rock band. And they split up, I think, around 2007. Had a pretty good sort of underground following, made some good records, but couldn't make it work enough to make a viable full-time living from the band. Their last album had been produced by a guy called Martin Doherty, who had also become a touring musician with the band. He played keyboards and additional guitar, I think. And him and Ian Cook decided they wanted to carry on collaborating. Both, I think, had just been getting a bit more into electronic sounds, so buying synthesizers, just experimenting with kind of retro 80s kind of electro sounds. So started coming up with some ideas for that. I think Cook had produced an EP by the band Blue Sky Archives not that long since. I'd remembered their lead singer Lauren Mayberry. I think he initially was planning to handle the vocals himself, and he thought he'd just get her in to sing some backing vocals, but then when they brought her in to record, her voice just fit the music so well, so they figured that they were going to make her the lead singer. And so these three people who've all come from this kind of indie rock, indie pop background are suddenly in this electro pop trio, just at a time really when that kind of sound was in resurgence. And they were probably a bit ahead of the curve as well. It made making really kind of bold, catchy electro-pop music with a strong 80s synth pop influence, but also with an indie sensibility. It was a pretty prescient move. If you think now, you've got people like Taylor Swift, notably, really just absolutely making a killing from that sound. But there's so much really popular charting music now that's built on that kind of cool retro pop sound. And Chvrches, I think, must have been one of the bands who were there right at the start of that revival of that sound. That's pretty cool. Really delighted to discover a lot more about them and actually get into listening to some of this stuff, because they've definitely got some really good songs, some really good arrangements. Lauren Mayberry's got some excellent lyrics and a really striking voice. I think her voice was one of the things that made me decide that Chvrches were going to be the band I was going to go for with this, just because she sings in her own accent, which I always love, and so few people do that in terms of UK bands in a mainstream charting kind of arena. Almost everyone still to this day sings in some kind of convoluted American accent, which I pretty much hate. So just hearing this great pop music with this Scottish accent, which I really needed for a Celtic rock thing, that was really great and really refreshing. I say Celtic rock, but it's a funny thing, really. I guess it does kind of exist as a genre, but it's a pretty nebulous genre. Most of the bands who you'd consider to be in it are kind of coming from slightly different directions. Obviously, my starting point for this was, as I say, Big Country, and they're definitely, for me, the most interesting band in that Celtic rock genre, mainly just because they're coming very much from a post-punk perspective. Stuart Adamson had obviously been in the Skids prior to Big Country, so coming straight out of punk, there's still plenty of that ethic in what they were doing. Coming from this post-punk scene, but then combining that aesthetic with Celtic-inspired melodies and these really striking guitar textures that used electric guitars to create these kind of bagpipe reel motifs in a lot of their most famous songs. In A Big Country, Fields of Fire, things like that. They're just really one of their main hooks, alongside the vocals of these really striking guitar riffs that just sound like bagpipes, and they're awesome. So that's the first thing that I was thinking of. That's the most obvious influence there. But because I wanted to broaden it a bit more into Celtic rock, I'm also taking into consideration the likes of Runrig, who I think one of the guys from Runrig was in an early incarnation of Big Country, but they went very much in their own direction, a bit more sort of bombastic 80s stadium filling folk pop rock. They definitely carried on well past the 80s, but I always think of their big booming kind of 80s sound that a lot of the stuff that I've heard by them has. The Waterboys, likewise, I mean, probably one of the more famous ones, just because Whole of the Moon was such a massive hit. Actually had quite a lot more to them than just that, but that's the sound that I tend to think of from them. Again, big 80s production was something that I was really going to go for. The huge booming drums, that big kind of cavernous sound, as well as the bands who are more tied to the more mainstream pop sound. There are also people who are coming more from a folk perspective, but incorporated elements of pop instrumentation, who you could consider to be part of the Celtic rock thing as well. I'm thinking of Caper Cayley, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, who emerged at the same time as the rest of these bands, but are probably more a straight up folk band that just happened to have electric instruments. But I figured it was worth keeping them in mind too when I was trying to come up with this sound. It's funny, really, because there's been plenty of Scottish and Celtic folk music that's mixed in with popular music and become kind of folk rock prior to this 80s wave of Celtic rock, and plenty since, but something to do with the combination of Celtic melodies and that 80s instrumentation and production value that just sent that particular wave of bands through the roof. And my thought for this alternative universe scenario this week was, in this other universe, we go back to when Aragorn had just split up. Cook and Doherty have decided they want to continue working together, and like in our universe, they're initially drawn to electronica, but then Cook just happens to pop on the TV one night and there's a BBC4 rerun of an old early 80s Top of the Pops on, and Big Country are on there doing Fields of Fire or some such, and a wave of nostalgia just hits him. He hadn't thought about this music for years, but it was obviously present when he was growing up. I think Ian Cook might be just a few years older than me, so he definitely would have grown up through all this as well. Hadn't thought about that sound for years, but now it's all he could think about. It just keeps echoing around in his mind. He thinks, oh, no one's done anything that sounds like that for years. Maybe it's time that we revive this. So persuades Martin Doherty to get on side, and then they decide they don't want to just be a nostalgia actor. They don't want to be just doing retro 80s music, but they bring in Lauren Mayberry, and obviously she's a bit younger younger, has a fresher perspective, brings a feminist perspective to the lyrics, which makes everything sound a bit new in spite of the kind of retro music that's going on. And they spearhead a whole revival of the Celtic rock sound, bringing in new listeners and whilst also winning over fans of the original wave. So when trying to turn Leave a Trace into an 80s Celtic rock sounding track, obviously as ever the first step is to just take the lead vocal, pop it into GarageBand. Decided I wanted to achieve a bit of that galloping big country rhythm, so I needed to speed it up a bit. So I took the tempo up a few notches, programmed some drums on there. The actual drum pattern, again, I was thinking of big country a little, so it's got some of that almost martial marching beat on the floor toms throughout the verses before going into a bit more of a conventional beat in the choruses. And in terms of the drum sound, really wanted to get that booming 80s sound, so I went for a big gated reverb on the snare and the toms just to give it that sort of massive 80s sound. Popped some bass on next. The bass I decided I was going to use to cover, there's a little synthesizer hook that runs through the original. I wanted to keep it to guitars, didn't want any synths on this. So I've got the bass with a fairly heavy flange effect on, and that's just playing a little chordal thing that at least evokes that synthesized line from the original. And then there's an absolute ton of guitars on there. A couple of overdriven rhythm guitars that are just playing a kind of fairly solid, chuggy, galloping, big country rhythm underneath. There's also an acoustic rhythm guitar that comes in the chorus just to fill it out and add a bit of a slightly folky sounding element to it as well. And then for the big country bagpipe guitars, we've got the main melody, which is played an octave apart by two separate tracks. And then I add a harmony as we get a little bit further along. And there's also a drone underneath, so just playing a kind of open fifth, sliding up slightly to just evoke that bagpipe drone underneath as well. And then as that part goes along, I also added, I really wanted to have a fife, the Scottish whistle, to get that traditional martial music sound over the top. Obviously, I don't have a fife sound or a real fife, but I managed to get a fairly acceptable fife sounding thing using the piccolo from the Spitfire Audio orchestra set that I've got. So just pop that along on top, just following that melody, but another octave higher as well as the song goes along. There's also one other guitar on there, just playing a really simple, clean 2 and 3 note patterns, but with timed echo on, so that it makes a rhythmic pattern throughout the song, which is less really a Celtic rock thing and more a U2 thing. But my reasoning was, I'm pretty sure a lot of those Celtic rock bands, U2 loomed fairly large over them, and it just fitted in really well. Hopefully the track as a whole sounds like the era and genre it's meant to evoke. Definitely sounds more big country than any of the other acts I mentioned, but that's kind of intentional. The video just took some good performance footage from a Chvrches show and a Top of the Pops performance of big country from the early 80s, which I just zoomed in to make them kind of the guitar elements of Chvrches, because obviously in Chvrches it's just Lauren out front and the two guys playing their synths, so I wanted to have someone playing guitar there as well. And then just the usual mixture of mocked up concert posters, some of which I think came out looking pretty good this week. I was quite happy with those. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more of the kind of atmosphere of the Celtic rock scene as well. There's a bit in the song where one of the guys, and I can't actually remember which one of them it is, I'm afraid, takes a little bit of lead vocal at kind of a bridge section. I feel bad because I basically removed that whole section. Just to explain why that happened, the isolated vocal that I found to use for this, while it had captured Lauren's vocal pretty well, it just didn't capture the male vocal well at all, so it was really messy, couldn't really hear that bit at all. So rather than having this noisy, almost inaudible vocal in there, I just took it out completely. So nothing personal against either of the guys in Chvrches, but it just wouldn't have worked. So I had to just find some other stuff to fill in that bit on the video as well, but hopefully I covered it over relatively seamlessly. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and if you did enjoy it, please like and subscribe subscribe. I always appreciate that. If there's anything you'd like me to take a look at in the future, any artists you'd like me to look at, any songs you'd like me to take on, or any genres you'd like me to try my hand at, please do just let me know as well. Always appreciate your suggestions. But otherwise, that's it from me for this week. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.